In 1938, the country became fascinated with the story of a demon-possessed 9-year-old girl from Lee County, Virginia. As the story went, this girl couldn't get any sleep because spirits would shake her bed to the point where she would, as she said, be sore all over. Today we tell the story of Bertha Sybert, known to all the world as Bouncing Bertha. Hello, folks. I'm Steve Gilly, along with Rod Mullins, and this is Stories, History of Appalachia. Now, Rod and I have a bit of a request of all of you. It may not sound like a lot, but we've topped 400 subscribers. Now, we would love to have 500 subscribers by the end of April. And we can do that if you'll just go down below and hit that subscribe button and join our little YouTube team, so to speak. We'd also appreciate it if you give us a thumbs up and leave a comment, too, if you don't mind.
Well, Steve, one thing's for sure. This week's story is going to be one that is of bouncing proportion because it's well known to a lot of people.
Yeah.
But I tell you, the inside part of this story, there are so many twists and turns. This one's an interesting one.
This is a good story. It does have a lot of twists and turns, and it brings in some folks we've talked about before on this podcast.
Yes.
In a way that you'll find a little fascinating.
Okay.
Bertha Marie Sybert lived with her grandmother, 71-year-old Rebecca Jane Sybert, in the Wallens Creek section of Lee County, Virginia, in 1938. Now, Bertha attended school in the area and, by all accounts, was a normal grade school-age girl. Well, she was, that is, until the fall of that year. You see, on November 18th, a spirit began visiting Bertha when she would go to bed. Now, her granny reported that every night when the sun went down, little Bertha's bed would begin to shake, and shake, and shake, and then rattle and roll all around the room. That bed would shake so violently.
Two hefty farmers weighing some 190 pounds apiece who tried to hold down that bed couldn't hold that ghost.
Very good.
Thank you.
This bedquake continued for over a month, during which time Bertha would be shaken violently every single night. By Christmas, news of the girl's predicament had made the news locally through news stories written by none other than renowned Lee County reporter, publisher, baseball impresario, and later filmmaker Virgil Q. Wax. He dubbed the girl Bouncing Bertha because of all that bed shaking.
Well, soon correspondents from all over the country began to arrive to witness Bouncing Bertha and her amazing ghostly bed. Pictures were taken of the family, all surrounding the haunted bed, and of little Bertha, with stories of hillbillies and witches and demons, all of them in Appalachia. There were locals who claimed to have seen the bed shaking. Raymond Miner, who was one of Sybert's neighbors, reported that he and 4 others had seen that
Bertha decided to sit up in a chair and not go to bed for a while. When the scheduled time came for the ghost to arrive, that chair began to walk. It moved backward about 4 feet with no one near it.
Well, another neighbor, Harrison Childers, was said to have witnessed a pale, lean, white hand appear at the head of the bouncing bed. He grabbed at that ghostly hand, and it promptly disappeared into thin air.
Well, Bouncing Bertha herself just wanted the bed to leave her alone. Now, her father reported that Bertha had been talking to the spirit and that she could get it to start the bed to shaking by saying, "Shake, shake big." He also said he thought his daughter was bewitched and that there was no ghost or spirit involved. Now, how did he know this, you might be asking? Well, he told another reporter that
it must be a witch because we've made every known investigation to determine its cause.
Now, it was also reported that the ghost would make a scratching sound, almost like a rat gnawing on wood, and that Bertha could even command it to do so by asking it to scratch.
Well, Steve, all of these stories, demons, spirits, witches in Appalachia, brought out the experts from all over to, well, poo-poo on such primitive notions. A professional magician by the name of John Mulholland, who was a close friend of none other than Harry Houdini and was an author of several books about magic and the sleight of hand, gave his opinion that Bouncing Bertha was pulling the wool over everybody's eyes and of anyone who believed her stories of spirits shaking the bed. Mulholland pointed out that in the most recent reports of supernatural manifestations, that it was young girls who were involved as mediums or victims, sort of like including the Salem witch trials, for example. He reported that every instance of children being bewitched or surrounded by ghosts was eventually discovered to be the work of the child seeking attention or playing pranks.
Well, Rod, eventually, two University of Tennessee professors got involved in this stuff, Alexa Brett and Dr. George Halselrud. Now, they watched Bertha in her shaking bed, and their conclusion? Well, it was caused by Bertha's involuntarily moving her muscles, that involuntary muscular action, not by ghosts or witches. Now, Bertha's family felt otherwise. They gathered nightly since November 16th, singing hymns, praying, and playing what the newspapers called hoedown music. But nothing worked. The ghosts or witches or whatever they were kept on shaking Bouncing Bertha's bed. Now, speaking of that hoedown music, Rod, on December 22nd, a neighborhood party was scheduled for a real hoedown dance to scare the spirits away from Grandma's house. But it wasn't held because the Wallens Creek police wanted to attend to make it official.
Well, Granny Sybert wasn't doing too well with all this hoopla, we'll say, because, she reported that the same day that if the shindig, as she called it, didn't scare the Haints away, she intended to abandon the house she had lived in since 1888. So by early February, Granny Sybert finally decided it was time. She was going to leave the cabin to go live for a while with the family of H.J. Yeary down the creek, as Bertha put it. Not forever, as she had threatened at Christmas time, but for something odd that had happened to her.
Yeah, apparently, while Grandma was sitting in her chair by the fireplace, the story goes, a witch snatched her sweater off of her, scaring her so she left home the next morning. According to Bouncing Bertha,
Granny said my bouncing bed and all those full wounds was bad enough without something bothering her clothes.
my guess is that all the hoopla caused by the bed, along with the press attention it brought, might have been getting to her. And speaking of the press, soon they were going around to Bertha's school to try to get what scoops they could get. Her teacher, Miss Janet Flannery at Sand Springs School, denied a rumor that Bertha had crawled down the aisle and was whipped for it. She did admit, though, that she'd had to punish the girl quite often. She also reported that someone had contacted her claiming to have been funded by the WPA, the Works Progress Administration, to write a book about mountain witchcraft and wanted to use Bouncing Bertha as the main story. Now, this guy wanted information from Miss Flannery for the book. She reported that she hadn't seen the bed move, but had seen the girl's pillow vibrate under her head.
Well, soon hundreds of curious visitors began to arrive at the cabin to see the amazing Bouncing Bertha for themselves. And Bertha was happy, yeah, that's right, happy to entertain them. They would plead for her to make the ghost do its scratching noise, but try as she might, she was never able to make the spirit perform for her, even though she asked it, "Scratch, rake, make noises, ghosts if you're there." A Dr. G.W. Young at one point suggested that Bertha be taken to none other than Western State Hospital in Marion, Virginia, for what we'd call a psych evaluation. The doctor opined that while Bertha remained happy in spite of the bouncing, that happiness was caused by
a physical and mental imbalance caused by imbalance of the secretion of her endocrine glands. She very likely had taken on a mental fixation complex and needs attention.
Well, Granny Sybert said that she was
battered a wet hen over the way poor little Bertha's been talked on. I thought she's fooling us up. I wouldn't let nobody in the house. Well, folks, the crowd soon got out of control, and the Lee County Sheriff, R.F. Giles, had to go to the Sybert home to control all the curious people there to see the bouncing bed. He reported that around 1,000 people came to the cabin that night.
Wow.
Sheriff Giles said that he planned to ask the Lee County Board of Supervisors to send Bouncing Bertha to a hospital for observation and treatment by skilled physicians. Now, that same evening, and probably the reason for all those folks showing up that night, radio station WOPI in Bristol sent a crew out to broadcast live from the Sybert cabin. The announcer, Harry Hudson, interviewed members of the family and put his microphone under the bed to get the sound of it beginning to shake, rattle, and roll.
Got a question for you right quick. How did they do things back in those days? I mean, you and I both were in radio at one time or another, but, they didn't have Marty units, microwave units, and so forth. Was it just on a phone line, or what was it at that time?
What they would do is the way they did it for years and years. They got what was called a phone loop, which was a special phone line that the phone company would drop at the place they were going to broadcast from. They'd hook up a little mixer, and then the other end would be attached at the radio station. And it was a bigger, thicker, I guess, copper pipe that would allow a better sound to go through it. But yeah, we used to do that way back in prehistoric days when we did basketball and football games.
Now, that's what we referred to as a trunk, wasn't it?
Yeah, that's exactly what it was. We called it a phone loop, though.
Phone loop, but, I can remember our illustrious manager at one time saying, plug it into the trunk. But anyway, let's go on. The Board of Supervisors, by the way, did consider the sheriff's request, but declined to involve itself upon the recommendation of Commonwealth's attorney, Robert Ely. Well, all of this craziness finally led Bertha's father, Frank, to close the doors to the public. The only public appearance after that for Bertha was an appearance at the Keithley Theater in Jonesville to see a movie at the invitation of the manager, Alexander Otto. Now, while there, Bertha was invited to tell the audience her experiences with the ghost. She answered questions from the audience and then closed out her appearance by reciting an 8-line poem to tremendous applause. But by springtime, Steve, the game, everything, whatever you want to call it, it was all over.
Oh, it was. You see, it was announced that Bouncing Bertha would be on hand to throw out the first pitch at the opening game in Pennington Gap for the Lee Bears. But due to an outcry against the move by baseball fans, that appearance was canceled. Now, Bertha then went on to lead a normal life. She grew up, ended up getting married. She was married, actually, I believe, twice and had 4 children. She died in June 1986 at Waverly in Surry County, Virginia.
Wow. And all of this, and then, well, we've talked about him before on here, folks. Virgil Q. Wax. He was, there's no other way to say this. This man was a publicity hound and hustler. That's about the best way you can say it. This guy, he had a region there for one period of time, at least, I guess, from the 50s or the 60s on into the 70s, maybe the early 80s, transfixed with seeing themselves on television with Virgil Q. Wax varieties. It was just unreal.
It was like antique YouTube, to be honest with you.
Yes, antique YouTube.
But that wasn't the only thing he had his fingers into.
True.
We mentioned the Lee Bears and the park there. Guess who was very highly involved in that? Virgil Q. Wax.
Virgil Q. Wax, yes.
He was a filmmaker, studied filmmaking, and I don't know this for a fact, but I'm thinking that he might have had some kind of an ownership in that theater that she appeared at. So you could see you could see his hands back behind all this stuff, pulling the strings and making her a superstar.
Wow. And the other thing we need to say also, all of these archives of the things that he was involved in, at least on the films and so forth, if I'm not mistaken, that is now the property of East Tennessee State University. Is that correct?
Yeah. The Appalachian Studies Department at ETSU has those. They were donated to him by his widow.
Hmm. And it's hard to see those things too. I guess, do you have to go in and see those things, or do they allow you to do that?
I don't know. I think they let researchers go in there and observe those. Whether, as a member of the general public, you can go in and see, I want to watch Virgil Q wax films, whether that let you, I don't know that for a fact.
Right. I know that they're very strict anymore with the way that some people like to go in and, how can we say it for lack of a better term, rip things out and rip things off of certain things. And so I'm sure that they would probably, if you came off the street with your video camera or your phone and you tried to copy some of these things, that would be strictly prohibited. So, but you could see some of these things, if I guess you were a researcher at East Tennessee State.
And folks, that's the story of Bouncing Bertha and her haunted bed. Another bit of the history of this place we call home, Appalachia. Thanks for listening. You can subscribe to the audio version of the podcast in many different ways, whether that be Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, Spotify, Audible, Amazon Music, etc., etc. We'd appreciate if you would subscribe to the audio version of Stories, A History of Appalachia. Till next we meet. So long, everybody.